right. Thank you to everyone who still had a little bit of energy at the end of the, I think, third day. At this point, it's blurring a little bit, of Identiverse to join me. This is my first Identiverse, so I am excited to speak to you about KYC SOS, or optimizing KYC friction to balance customer experience against identity vulnerabilities. Now, I usually speak to groups that are dedicated to payments and fraud. Like, I'm very active within the Merchant Risk Council, merchant payment ecosystems, and a few other orgs. But I do still think that what I've got to present today, even though it's generally stuff that's mostly for that audience, is really applicable to the idea of identity, because so much of those worlds with identity and then payments fraud, e-commerce fraud, etc., they aren't just converging now. They have converged, but we're just beginning to sort of figure out what that means for us in our fraud prevention efforts. So I'll tell you a little bit about me first. I've got about 15 years of experience in fraud prevention, primarily for marketplaces. I got my start at Etsy. Yes, there's fraud on Etsy, even though it's a nice site for handmade and vintage items. Moved on to Airbnb, where, of course, then you get the added component of people meeting in real life, along with fraud. Spent a few years at a company called First Dibs, which was luxury. So if you want to hear stories about $70,000 Rolexes or $200,000 Hermes Birkin bags, and the links fraudsters will go to create fake identities in order to try to purchase those, I've got plenty of stories there. And then lastly, at Let Go, which was a secondhand sales marketplace. But for the past 4 years, I have been with SIFT as one of their trust and safety architects, which means I take all of that experience and I help inform the product, which is, of course, fraud prevention. That's what SIFT specializes in. And I'm able to also use that for educating customers, and I get to run our Deep and Dark Web, or our DDW investigations team. So I get to share a lot of the intelligence that we gather from various sites on the dark web, from Telegram groups, and that is where a lot of the examples that I have today come from. But first, to start off with KYC, we have to acknowledge who these sites are actually made for and who we actually want to be interacting with us, and that is our customer, our end user. And they're going to have a preference about how much data they hand over. These are just some quick screenshots of examples of people debating and trying to understand why they're being asked for certain data points. Here on the left is somebody posting to Reddit, trying to figure out why, as a writer, they need to provide an ID to Lyft. And then all of those wonderful clickbaity, shocked-looking screenshots from YouTube are videos where people are calling out verification and authentication, shocked that an ID is required. I failed authentication. Here's how to avoid Airbnb regulation, which I can guarantee some people at Airbnb have watched that video to see what he says and to make sure it doesn't work. But in the end, we know we've got a weird balance to strike, where customers are not going to want to fully opt in to giving us all of the data that we may think is necessary in order to verify them, but we still need to require something. And that's where it comes down to this idea that trust isn't binary. It's not just a decision of, will the consumer trust my site or my entity, yes or no? It's how much will they trust us? A good example of how that's changed before is Facebook. So when Facebook was just a social media site, you used them and you trusted them with your photos. Maybe you trusted them with your wall posts, if you remember back that far. You trusted them with your messages. But did you trust them with your financial information? Well, when they launched Facebook Marketplace, that's a decision people had to make in order to add payment methods to social media. Same with Instagram, adding a payment method to be able to do that social shopping. That's a different level of trust than just general information. And people might not understand that step up or really know what the risks are in the end, because this guy posting on Reddit is probably thinking, I can jump in a cab in New York City without showing my ID. Why does Lyft need it? So a lot of this is about consumer communication, but of course, what you need to meet your verification goals. And fraudsters are watching and ranking different sites and services based on what decision you reach. So this next screenshot is from a now defunct dark web marketplace, which is kind of redundant to say because they all seem to be getting shut down. after a little bit of time and then pop back up under a new name. I believe this was Alphabet, and this was a screenshot from their checkout flow. And so you see here I've cut out the item information for what we had added to cart, but in general this is showing 4 payment method options and then giving a little help to people to understand how to use some of those. What you'll notice is when you go from sort of the most anonymous, which we can debate if Bitcoin is anonymous or not, but the most privacy-focused anonymous method they can find here at this end, all the way down to a live credit card payment, which they consider to be the least anonymous. They have to run over traditional payment rails, etc. The price increases. So they're actually saying if you don't go with our preferred payment method, you don't get a discount. See, there's shopping discounts, there's coupon codes in equivalent on these sites. And if you don't have Bitcoin, no problem. Click one of the buttons below. Now, I do want to call out there's a lot of different brands and company names that pop up in the presentation, and then every now and then I've obscured them if there was something really specific, like something in parentheses that gave away a particular method. But in general, I didn't blur any out. But here you see they've ranked the 4 different providers from no KYC required through to easy KYC required. And if you have trouble getting past those steps and understanding the difference, there's plenty of discussion on forums to let you know which one or how to proceed with those services. And I thought it was really interesting to see there on the right where someone said, I'm fine with paying $5 in fees for no KYC verification. Well, we know why fraudsters want to avoid KYC. But does anyone know why they don't mind if they have to, let's say, pay more in fees to process certain payments if they get to avoid KYC? Like, why don't they care about the financial side of it?
Not their money anyway.
Yeah, they are probably using a stolen payment method. You're 100% right. So they would rather be anonymous and be less easily tracked for longer than worry about money and it's going to hit the company that's processing that anyway and they're going to feel a loss there. So in this instance, they're learning to bypass. And even if you were a fraudster who wasn't thinking about identity and you weren't thinking about bypassing KYC on the websites or the companies that you work for, you are getting these ideas of, I should be working to remain anonymous, I should be focused on my privacy. And that can bring you into then finding more tutorials and advice. So here we've got different screenshots. These are all, well, the top 2 are from Telegram. The bottom is from Dread Forums, which is, if they're not experiencing a DDoS attack, a pretty good place to get some information. They never get rid of their archives, so you can search years back for different types of fraud chatter. But we've got examples of taking credit card and then cashing that out into Bitcoin with lots of steps through how to do so and not get caught. Over here, we've got someone offering a KYC bypass mentorship. And then down here, we've got some very detailed discussion. This was on a particular crypto wallet and just giving recommendations on names needing to match, et cetera, which might not have been required by another platform. But I do want to talk about the mentorships for a minute because those are really fascinating with what they can monetize. I've seen some other presentations this week talk about fraudsters who will steal information to then be able to use it themselves or to sell it on, but others actually just want to share their knowledge. Like they become teachers and they will package what they've learned and then resell that. This $300 is kind of reasonable. I think the most expensive mentorship rate that I currently see is for refund fraudsters. Now, those are the fraudsters that target physical goods websites like your Target, your Walmart. Sorry if you're in here from either of those. But that usually gets priced around $1,000 minimum because it is so lucrative, and that is not a type of fraud that those merchants have solved for well at this point. And so there's a lot of potential and upside to make money off of that type of fraud. So besides these tutorials here, again, knowing that I didn't have as much time, trying to keep it high level, I sort of just focused on the financial side. But you'll see anything that can be monetized, fully explained and packaged to then educate someone who is an entry-level fraudster. Some examples that I thought were pretty interesting. I live in New York City, and you can find easily tutorials on how to pay your New York City parking tickets using stolen funds and to bypass those systems. You can find tutorials on how to obtain a disabled parking pass in many different municipalities so that you can provide the false documentation that shows that you actually need one, because fraudsters love the easiest path, and if that means they get to park at the front of a parking lot, that's what they might use those skills or that drive for. And then, even beyond that, there was a huge explosion during the pandemic of tutorials around very specific small business loan funds or anything else that's tied back to pandemic fraud, fake COVID ID creation, so many different things available that it really just takes the ability to do a keyword search once you know where to get into these fraud groups. And if anyone is interested in starting some of this research, you can find a good number of these groups advertised on Reddit or via some WhatsApp channels or on Discord. But you don't even really need that, because you can obviously just go straight to Telegram and start searching and find these pretty easily. Okay, so if the prior slide was about learning to bypass, or learning that it's necessary to bypass that kind of KYC, this one is focusing on what can we exploit and what can we get from our abilities to do so. And even then, there's a wide range of tools that they can choose from. Now, I specifically kept this slide with screenshots that we took from our research at minimum over 2 years ago, because I wanted to show that even before this explosion in the discussion of AI and deepfakes, they were already working on doing it. They already knew how to manipulate IDs. They already had some technology. It's just that now that's the topic that is top of everyone's mind. And of course, their ability to scale this type of fraud has improved greatly with the availability and accessibility of generative AI. But it's not that it's a new technology, it's just that now it's newly accessible to the masses. So these are still pretty good frameworks and representations of what they can do. Was everyone here early in the morning on, I think it was not day one, that was the afternoon, when that deepfake video was shown where the speaker had duplicated himself and he made the joke about turning his head side to side? Yeah, that is something pretty easy for the fraudsters to do, because they've already got years of experience doing so. One thing we've seen chatter around most recently is that knowing, or merchants knowing that there's more of a likelihood deepfakes might be used in video verification, some of those companies have started asking people not to turn your head side to side and say numbers, but to do something that obscures part of the face, like cover your right eye or cover your mouth, something that would tear the filter, potentially. And so now we're seeing fraudsters complain about that and coming up with better filtering techniques that understand that a hand is going to enter the screen, or that you might be required to, turn around fully or take some extra action, and they're already working against that. So those, advancements are already in the pipe. Then the one in the middle, we've got a guy who is talking about not only bypassing verification, but packaging that with merchant accounts that he set up, one there for Stripe. And then the guy at the end I still included because one really important part about fraudsters having trust within their own community on these Telegram channels and on the dark web is posting vouchers. They don't really have a way to have reviews or have people believe that they can offer what they're saying they can offer, but they will run vouch channels where they have happy customers thanking them for everything they were able to get away with from using their tools, etc. And that is just an example of a vouch video showing off that his identification bypass worked. Now, another thing I want to call out with the availability of these tools is that it's really up to the individual who's going to commit fraud as to how involved they want to be. Because there is the option to participate in something called fraud as a service, where you're just paying a small fee in, and the fraudster is basically doing everything for you. This happens so often with food delivery fraud. So somebody will just provide usually it's a screenshot of a cart that shows the items they want from a particular restaurant, and they provide a delivery address. They're usually told Don't give us your home address. Don't be stupid. Make it your neighbor 3 doors down, and then just go wait in front of your neighbor 3 doors down for the delivery to come. So you burn that address instead. And the fraudster will take it from there, usually for a 20% fee paid in Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency, and send the food on over. And that happens so regularly that there are numerous fraudsters where that's their full-time job, and they have employees underneath them that are just covering all different geos to make sure those orders get fulfilled. And they'll even expand to offering QR code tableside payments, because that became such a popular way to have contactless payment at restaurants. And most of those restaurants never incorporated into their fraud prevention stack the ability to see where that payment was actually coming from. You know, the device that actually ended up submitting payment via this QR code, is it physically in my restaurant or is it 200 miles away? They didn't consider that being an issue, and so that's another great business point for these particular fraudsters. And it's not just these types of tools that you can get there. There's a few more I wanted to mention, one being AIO checkers, or all-in-one checkers. That is where all I have to do is pay for access to their tool. They maintain multiple modules, which are scripts they've built over various websites, where they will check credentials against those sites and then return to me the results of how many worked and were able to log in, or how many, didn't work. And then of those that did work, how many, for example, had a credit card on file or a balance on file, depending on that type of site. And so I, as a fraudster, if I have a phishing site running, or if I've otherwise bought a batch of credentials via a breach, maybe those were packaged to go against a company like Airbnb. But if I buy an AIO checker, access it for just a week or two, I could run it against a couple of hundred other websites and see where else people reuse the same password, and then see what else I can do to, get more bang for my buck with those credentials I stole. I don't need to describe OTP bots. I think we all know what that is. And I did mention fraud as a service, so I think that is a good look then at the tools and services we've got that far. But I don't like going to presentations where all we talk about is just like, look at this. Isn't this terrible? Anyway, see you. Goodbye. I want to be able to talk about some of the strategy and implementation of the knowledge that we gain from watching these forums and what we can do with it. And so that's where I first want to call out knowing your enemy. Now, I didn't put any very specific examples up here because that's not something that I am allowed to do, but I have some examples that I can talk through where we've been able to work with companies and have them actually learn from the intelligence of monitoring the deep and dark web and tie that back into their fraud prevention. So one company, it's a very well-known QSR or quick service restaurant. They use a lot of different payment processors, and fraudsters had figured out that one particular payment processor, only via the mobile app, had a vulnerability that if you entered the CVV code, or your 3 or 4 digit code that you have to do to verify your credit card, as 0000, you would bypass their fraud prevention fully. And I know that that worked because I talked to that company and they immediately got so angry because that was a bug within that integration of that payment processor in their app that they had been complaining to product about for so long, for months. But here I was with screenshots saying, yeah, and fraudsters know they need to do that, and they don't know why it only works on the mobile app. But they have figured out if they're in this country with this app, this will work. 0000, they've already figured it out and they are taking advantage. So we were able to then loop it back and say, it's not just an integration error, it's not just an inconvenience that it's bypassing fraud prevention, it's a known vulnerability and we need to address it. So that helped get that floated up within the org. Another conversation that I've had was with a subscription website where they offer a 30-day free trial to new users. And of course, fraudsters love to sign those accounts up and then resell those because that's easy. You don't even really need a credit card that will eventually work. You just tell people, I'll give you your new credentials on the first day of every month, and they just hand them a new free trial sign up, and that person gets to watch whatever, read whatever constantly. But this fraudster got lazy with the patterning that they would change their passwords to before they handed that new account over to someone to be able to use it. And so I know we've all got that security set up within our system where we can tell if someone's reusing the same password they had used before. You can, in fact, look for some similarities, even though you're not going to surface that information. It should still remain obscured to everyone within your company. But we were able to pass that along to them, and they could set up those sort of keyword monitors. And when they did that, they found such an abusive pattern of their free trial accounts that they had just thought, oh, we're not converting, but maybe it was a marketing issue or customers didn't see the value in the product. No, people weren't converting because there was a whole bunch of fraudsters just cycling through your free trials. And that is something that they could go back to their company, patch that vulnerability. So that was another one of my favorite ones. And then the others get a lot more specific, and so I'm not as able to do a deep dive there. But it's something, if you haven't considered this, there is a lot of value in doing this research. And when I talk to e-commerce and payments, I will often use a user flow like this, which can be kind of similar to a verification flow, but this is really focused on looking at an entire user journey from first signing up with a website into, let's just say in this example for e-commerce, making a purchase. Now across the bottom, we have sort of the path of least resistance for somebody who maybe has a created account a while ago, and we are very familiar with them. We trust the device that they're coming from. We know that that is not outside of their purchase pattern. So we have pretty low scores here represented by the 30 in green circles down to their order being accepted. But let's step up and look at the top line. Now this is an individual who comes from, let's say, just a suspicious IP. We don't need to kind of know why, but it does within the system trigger the need for identity verification. Now, that could be through many different processes, but let's just put a pin in that and say that whatever KYC was required, the customer fulfilled that, and then they added a card to their account, which slightly elevated their risk, but nothing to be too concerned about. They passed a 2FA challenge that was set up, added an item to their cart, but then we have a geo mismatch within the IP address and the device. So we have a change in the location where they are, and also let's assume in where that item is being shipped to. And then lastly, they're asked for a 3DS check, a pretty straightforward check that will confirm if they have the cell phone attached to the account, whatever other step there, and that's when the order spikes up to a really high score of a 95 with the red circle. But that's all the way at the end. So it doesn't seem that useful, does it? We've let them get through all of this, and now we're rejecting the order only at the end. Why wasn't this score earlier on risky? Why, when they verified their identity, didn't we notice anything? Can anybody think of a pattern of usage behavior? And again, I didn't put timeline up here. I didn't say how much time is between each of these steps. Could anyone think of a sort of a pathway where a company would see this data or would see this user activity and it would end up making sense for a well-known type of fraud? Yeah, and it is vague, but
Beyond just regular credit card theft, I don't know.
so there is the potential for it being account takeover with that geo mismatch. But I think the most well-known site that has operated a botnet group of a significant magnitude is Genesis. It was shut down a year ago. There have been others that have replaced it, but it's still an example that when I throw it out, most people are familiar with it. And that was a site where you, as a fraudster, could buy not someone's stolen credentials, just static, but access to their device via malware that had been installed on their device. And part of what Genesis sold was a constant update of any credentials that were created on that device or changed on that device. So if somebody had a Gmail account and they changed their password, you would get their new password. If they created a new account on a site that was part of what Genesis could detect within the compromised browsers, you would get that sent to you. So maybe these first 3 steps here are the legitimate customer. and they've set up an account, they added a card, they enabled 2FA, whatnot. All that information is, of course, getting sent to the person who owns access to their device. And this person goes, oh, that's so great. They added this. I've been wanting to buy XYZ. Steps in. That's where the geo mismatch hits. But unfortunately for them, this kind of fraudster didn't have a great credit card where they could, let's say, do OTP bypass. They couldn't pass that 3DS check. And that's where you realize something was going on. They made it that far down the line. One of the reasons that I'll use this slide when I talk to fraud and payments experts is because I want to make sure that when they get all the way to the end of this story, they're not adding all of this data to a block list. They're not making an assumption that right here in the beginning, that this is an identity we need to block from using our platform. There is a story that can be told by this user journey, and in this case, it does not necessarily mean that this was a fraudulent individual, and it could mean that if you were to train your model, or if you were to take action on all of this data as being fraudulent across the board, that you're not going to be making the best decision, and you're not going to have the healthiest machine learning model fighting fraud. So this, to close, fits in the middle of a stack with workflow rules and automation that an analyst needs to be able to do some kind of QA on and keep healthy, that is then, of course, interpreted to the rest of the company via reporting. And then going the other way from what we just looked at, maintaining that machine learning model like we discussed, and identifying high-volume data that can be ingested and can give the most reliable score and help tell that story that we just went through. So, again, I know this is not the most standard presentation for Identiverse, but if you have any questions about DDW investigation or about kind of how these pathways that go over an entire user journey can work, I'll be happy to answer questions. And otherwise, please make sure you eat dinner before going over to the Palms. It is hot out there, and I doubt we'll all be as hydrated as we should be.
It's a Palms pool here, not the Palms.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought we were all heading out.
That's been confusing to people.
This man has saved me an awkward cab ride and then standing on the corner wondering what's going on.
Pool here called the Palms pool.
Oh, okay.
It's like right outside.
I said it was my first time. I'm doing my best, guys.
One of my coworkers was ready to make that cab ride too. It's a long cab ride.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And I'll see you all tomorrow or tonight. All right.